Hello and welcome. Today we will be starting the first of a series of lectures which will walk you through hands-on on how to rapidly develop an enterprise web application using Angular 2 Plus and .NET Core. Who is this course for? This course is tailored towards people that know about computers and have built a complete server-side website previously. If you haven't, please refer to my .NET Core introductory course and beginning programming introductory course before coming to this. Because if you can't build a server-side website and don't know what that is, you're going to be lost in this course. So this is tailored towards people that know what a web server is, people that are familiar with JavaScript and CSS and HTML. And once again, this is not a beginner course. I expect you to know about programming before starting this. What we'll be doing in this course: we will be building a REST application. I'll discuss what this is later. That utilizes Angular 2 Plus, the Angular 2 Plus framework for its client-side technology, and C#.NET Core for its backend. The database we'll be using to store information is called Microsoft SQL Server. I will introduce you to technologies and concepts as we proceed through these lectures, although we won't be delving too deeply into them. That will aid you in rapidly simplifying your development process and tasks. We will get into more advanced concepts after developing the initial build and tasks you will often encounter in the industry. Some examples of more advanced concepts that we'll delve into are system integrations and dealing with large amounts of data and large amounts of processing. So you might be asking yourself, what is Angular 2 Plus? Angular 2 Plus and even Angular is a front-end technology that runs completely in your browser, aka your computer, rather than the website owner's web server. It was created by Google. It is an object-oriented programming language. Angular 2 Plus is completely different from Angular. Basically, what happened is that Google created this framework called Angular and then realized it had some shortcomings that the developers didn't like. Some complexities that were introduced that they realized after they had built the initial framework and started using it. So then they rebuilt the language or the framework, starting with Angular 2 and its preceding versions, in order to simplify and fix these shortcomings. So because Angular 2 is the rebuild, the plus sign is often used to depict the versions after the rebuild, like versions 2, 4, 5, 6, etc. They skipped Angular 3. They don't have a version 3 of Angular, and that's an interesting story in and of its own, but I won't delve into it. And unlike Angular, the initial version, which was built upon JavaScript, Angular 2 Plus uses a language abstraction of JavaScript called TypeScript. It's an object-oriented language. So now that we discussed the front-end technology, let's get into the back-end technology that we'll be using, which is .NET Core. It's a back-end language, or in our case, the language running on our server. .NET Core is a rebuild of Microsoft's .NET framework. Just like Google rebuilt Angular, Microsoft found that there was a lot of bulk and things in its original .NET framework that were slowing it down. So they decided to rebuild it so that it was lighter weight, faster, and better in many cases. We will be using this to build out our REST API, or application user interface. If you don't know what that means, don't worry. We're going to be delving into that very soon. So when we're building out this application, because there are a lot of ways that people approach building web applications, and the technology has developed a lot, and a lot of people are very strongly opinionated on how they build it. I'm taking a certain approach based on what I've seen in the different companies I've worked for in order to minimize the complexity and the maintenance and the problems that we'll be encountering later on. Firstly, we're going to minimize logic in the .NET layer. The reason for this is because when a lot of the code goes into the .NET layer, there's a lot more variation in how the site is built and structured and organized. Thus, by minimizing the amount of code and logic that is in this layer and putting it into our database, it'll actually simplify in the long term our website's complexity. So it will exponentially reduce the complexity of our website. We will be putting all our data processing logic in our database in things called stored procs. Don't worry, we'll get into what that is later on. Furthermore, we'll be using things called database clusters, virtual machines, and load balancers to deal with the issue of scalability and handling more users in the case that our website gets very widely used in the future. How our website's going to look. So I drew a pretty little picture for you guys. So on the left, we see our front end. It'll be communicating with our .NET layer core, .NET Core middle layer. And then our middle layer, which is running on our server, will communicate with the database backend. And that's how the information will flow back and forth. So whenever a user interacts with our front end, which is basically the user interface, it will and needs information or wants to pass back information to be stored, it'll pass back into our .NET Core layer and then go to our database. We'll delve more into this later on. So arguments for my design. So you're going to hear a lot from different people with regards to how to approach this. I've worked in a lot of companies. I've worked in Fortune 500 companies as well as small companies and everything in between. I've worked at over 10 companies in the past doing contracts. And there is variation in how people approach web development and build websites. What I found is that code-first approaches can get overly complicated and hard to maintain for people outside of the original developers because they're going to understand it the best. Database first approaches, if the database developers are knowledgeable about database development, will allow for more stability to the system long term and fewer introduction of bugs. I'll discuss this a little bit more in detail later on. Another thing we'll be doing is we're going to be coupling the system to SQL Server. The reason for this is because in my experience, decoupled systems that use middle tier framework like Entity Framework or Hibernate, which basically build out this, interact with your database and keep all the data processing activities in the .NET layer, are harder to hire decent developers for. So you're going to have to hire university grads and stuff like that. Furthermore, the amount of, which is not bad, but even when you hire them, oftentimes they're going to have difficulty dealing with these frameworks and the amount of complexity added to the .NET layer. Because as I said, when code is in the .NET layer, there's a lot of flexibility and difference in libraries that can be used to, and organization of the code. As a result, it could, as people come from different universities and different backgrounds, they could introduce different unique issues into the system, and it could actually destabilize the system or introduce bugs and stuff like that. And over time, as the system develops and more hands touch it, it gets harder to maintain, or you become dependent on a core developer who knows everything about it, and everyone else is just asking them questions. And when that developer goes, everyone's in trouble because they're going to take that knowledge with them. And then there are going to be all these rules in that middle layer that no one really understands, and everyone will be afraid to touch it because it might introduce issues with the downstream system because no one knows the reason for something and how it was built. So thus, this is the reason why I'm suggesting putting all the business logic in stored procs, because it leads to more maintainable systems long term, especially if it's going to be around 30 years or more. Um, so yeah, so that's all for our first slide. So get ready for more. Till next time.